In this video, we're going to talk about every single time Lois Griffin proved she was absolutely the worst wife in animated television history. Let's get started. But before we dive into the chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we've got 2 full hours of Family Guy lore coming your way. Perfect for falling asleep to or just learning exactly how terrible Lois can be. We're starting with one of the most disturbing things Lois has ever done, and honestly, this episode alone could end any real marriage instantly. This is psychological abuse disguised as solving a bedroom problem, and it ends in one of the most traumatic moments in the entire series. The episode is called The Manchurian Candidate, and it aired during season 21. The title is a play on The Manchurian Candidate, that old movie about brainwashing and mind control, which should immediately tell you where this is going. Lois decides that Peter isn't performing well enough in bed, specifically when it comes to oral sex, and instead of having an adult conversation about it, or accepting that maybe her husband has boundaries, she decides the solution is literal mind control. Let's be clear about what happens here. Lois takes Peter to a couples therapist, which seems reasonable at first. Communication is important in marriage, right? But when talking doesn't immediately get Lois exactly what she wants, she doesn't compromise or work through it. Instead, the therapist suggests hypnosis, and Lois jumps on this idea without any consideration for the ethical nightmare she's about to create. During the hypnosis session, something goes wrong. Peter's phone goes off, playing the jingle from Extra, that celebrity gossip show. The jingle becomes Peter's trigger phrase instead of whatever the therapist was trying to program. Now, here's where any decent person would stop and say, "This is dangerous. We need to undo this immediately." But Lois, she's totally fine with it. She's got her mind-controlled husband now, and she's going to use him whenever she wants. Consent be damned. Think about what's actually happening here. Every time Peter hears this specific sound, he goes into a trance state where he has zero control over his actions. He's not choosing to do anything. He's literally being controlled like a puppet. And Lois knows this. She understands completely that Peter isn't consenting to what's happening, that he's essentially being forced through hypnotic programming, and she doesn't care at all. In fact, she actively uses this trigger over and over again to get what she wants. The show tries to play this for laughs initially. We see Peter going about his day, and whenever that extra jingle plays, he immediately drops whatever he's doing and enters this trance state. The visual representation is actually pretty dark. When Peter's under hypnosis, he imagines he's at a beach licking ice cream cones. It's the show's way of making the situation seem more innocent. But what's actually happening is sexual acts without consent. That's not funny. That's horrifying. But here's where it gets even worse. And this is the part that makes this episode genuinely one of the most disturbing things Family Guy has ever done. Peter and Lois go to visit her parents at the Pewterschmidt mansion. Lois's mother, Babs, is bedridden upstairs. Peter, being a decent guy despite all his flaws, offers to bring Babs her dinner. He goes upstairs with a plate of food, and this is where the timing becomes absolutely catastrophic. Babs is watching television in her bed. And what show does she have on? Extra. The moment that jingle plays, Peter's hypnotic programming kicks in instantly. Lois, downstairs, suddenly realizes what time it is and what show her mother watches. The horror dawns on her face as she understands exactly what's about to happen. She runs upstairs as fast as she can, screaming for Peter to stop, but she's too late. Peter has already performed oral sex on Lois's mother, his own mother-in-law, a woman who's probably in her 70s or 80s, and he had absolutely no control over his actions. Zero consent, zero awareness until after the fact. When Peter snaps out of the trance and realizes what just happened, his reaction is pure trauma. He's completely horrified, devastated, violated in a way that's genuinely hard to watch even in an animated comedy. The show doesn't shy away from showing how this destroys Peter. The drive home is completely silent except for Peter repeatedly trying to process what happened to him. There's no jokes, no cutaway gags, just Peter sitting in the passenger seat, absolutely shattered. When they get home, he runs to the bathroom and vomits violently. This is a man who's been through countless insane situations in the show, but this breaks him in a way nothing else has. And Lois? Her reaction is basically just being upset that her sex scheme backfired. She's not horrified that she mind-controlled her husband into a sexual situation. She's not devastated that her selfish decision led to Peter being violated. She's just annoyed that her plan went wrong. There's no real apology, no acknowledgement of the genuine psychological damage she's caused, no attempt to immediately get Peter professional help or to undo the hypnosis. She's primarily concerned with the awkwardness of the situation, rather than the trauma she's inflicted. But wait, it gets even worse. The episode doesn't end with them fixing the problem. Peter is still hypnotized. The trigger phrase still works. And in the final moments of the episode, Meg is watching television downstairs when Extra comes on again. The jingle plays, and Peter immediately starts moving toward Meg with that same trance-like state. Lois realizes what's happening and tries desperately to hold Peter back, screaming his name over and over. But the implication is absolutely clear. Lois's selfish decision to mind control her husband for sexual purposes has now put her own daughter in danger. Think about the layers of terrible behavior here. First, Lois violated her husband's consent and bodily autonomy because she wanted better sex. Second, she continued using the hypnotic trigger even after seeing it work, never considering the potential consequences. Third, when the worst possible outcome happened with her mother, she still didn't immediately fix the problem. And fourth, her lack of action after the first disaster has now created a situation where Peter might assault his own daughter, and it would be entirely Lois's fault. This isn't played as Lois being a terrible wife in the usual Family Guy way, where characters do outrageous things that get reset by the next episode. This is genuinely dark. The episode is framed as a horror story, complete with the silence and trauma that follows. Even the show seems to recognize that Lois crossed a line that can't really be walked back. There's no happy ending here. No moment where everything gets fixed and everyone laughs about it. The episode ends on the implication of potential incest, with Lois having created this entire nightmare scenario through her selfishness. What makes this even more disturbing is that nobody in the episode really calls Lois out properly. The therapist who suggested hypnosis doesn't face any consequences. Brian and the other friends don't intervene or point out how insane this situation is. And Lois herself never has a moment of genuine reckoning where she admits that what she did was absolutely unforgivable. The show treats it as a situation that went too far, but not as Lois being a genuinely abusive spouse who should face serious consequences. In any real relationship, this would be grounds for immediate divorce and probably legal action. Lois essentially drugged her husband with hypnotic programming to sexually assault him whenever she wanted. That's not a punchline. That's a crime. And the fact that Peter's trauma is played for some level of comedy, even dark comedy, doesn't change the fundamental reality of what Lois chose to do. The Manchurian Candidate represents Lois at her absolute worst because it strips away any pretense that she's the responsible adult in the family. Peter might be an idiot, but he's never weaponized Peter's vulnerabilities against him in this calculated way. Lois saw a problem in her marriage, decided the solution was to remove her husband's free will, and then refused to properly fix the situation, even after it resulted in one of the most traumatic experiences of Peter's life. That's not being a bad wife. That's being a monster. Now let's talk about the time Lois had a midlife crisis and nearly committed a felony with a teenage pop star. This episode shows that when Lois feels insecure about herself, she doesn't work on her marriage or seek healthy coping mechanisms. Instead, she completely abandons her family, spirals into destructive behavior, and literally tries to seduce someone young enough to be her son. The episode is called Lois Comes Out of Her Shell, and it aired during season 11. Right from the title, you can tell this is going to be about Lois shedding her responsible mom persona and doing something completely reckless. The setup is actually pretty sympathetic at first. Lois is turning 43 years old, and she's feeling insecure about aging. This is a totally normal human experience. Getting older can be scary, especially for women who face enormous societal pressure about maintaining their youth and appearance. Brian suggests throwing Lois a surprise birthday party, which seems like a sweet gesture. The family decorates, they get a cake, they invite friends over. Everything seems fine until Peter decides to give a speech. Now, Peter being Peter, you'd expect him to say something stupid. But what he actually does goes way beyond typical Peter idiocy. He reads a poem that absolutely destroys Lois's self-esteem. The poem is brutal. Peter compares Lois to a plow horse, talks about her aging body in the most unflattering terms possible, and basically announces to everyone at the party that his wife has lost her youth and attractiveness. He calls her old, makes jokes about her body sagging, and treats the whole thing like it's hilarious. The room goes completely silent. Everyone realizes Peter just humiliated his wife in front of all their friends and family on her birthday. Lois is devastated. She runs out of her own party crying, and Peter just stands there confused about why everyone's upset. Now here's where we need to be fair for a second. Peter genuinely messed up. He hurt Lois's feelings in a really public and cruel way. Her reaction of being upset is completely justified. If the episode had been about Lois confronting Peter about his insensitivity, demanding better treatment, maybe even separating temporarily until he learned to respect her, that would have been reasonable. But that's not what happens. Instead, Lois uses Peter's insensitivity as justification for behavior that's arguably way worse than anything Peter did. Lois disappears for the entire night. The family has no idea where she is. When she finally shows up the next morning, she's completely transformed. She's dyed her hair blonde with highlights. She's wearing clothes that look like they came from a teenager's closet, and she's talking in text message abbreviations and internet slang. She tells everyone she got work done down there, so things are tighter now, which is way too much information to share with her children. The whole family is standing there in shock as Lois announces that she's basically becoming a completely different person. Brian immediately recognizes what's happening. He tells Peter that Lois is having a midlife crisis, and he's absolutely right. But what starts as an understandable reaction to feeling old quickly spirals into genuinely destructive behavior that puts her entire family at risk. Lois starts going out to clubs every single night. She's staying out until dawn, dancing with people half her age, drinking heavily, and completely ignoring her responsibilities as a mother and wife. Peter tries to keep up with her at first. He attempts to match her energy, going to the clubs, dancing, drinking, trying to prove he can still be fun and young too. But Peter's in his 40s and overweight. He physically cannot maintain this lifestyle. He's exhausted, falling asleep at the clubs, begging to go home. And instead of recognizing that her husband is trying his best to support her through this crisis, Lois just ditches him. She literally abandons Peter at the club and goes off to party with a group of teenage girls she just met. Think about what this means for the Griffin family dynamic. Lois is the one who usually holds everything together. She makes sure the kids get to school. She manages the household. She keeps Peter from completely destroying their lives. But now, she's gone every night, sleeping all day, and contributing absolutely nothing to the family. Chris and Meg are confused and worried. They don't understand why their mom is suddenly acting like a completely different person. And Peter, despite being hurt and exhausted, is trying to hold everything together while his wife is out living like she's 20 years old again. The situation escalates when Lois starts getting more and more reckless. She's not just going to clubs anymore. She's getting tattoos, which is fine for adults to do. But she's making these decisions impulsively as part of a crisis rather than as thought-out choices. She's shopping compulsively, spending money the family probably doesn't have on an entirely new wardrobe. She's staying out with these teenage girls who are encouraging her worst impulses because they think having a fun older woman around is cool. Then comes the Justin Bieber concert. A local news report shows that Justin Bieber is performing in Quahog, and teenage girls all over town are losing their minds with excitement. The news cameras pan across the crowd outside the venue, and there's Lois, right in the middle of a group of screaming teenagers, acting exactly like them. She's wearing the same kind of clothes, jumping up and down, screaming for Justin Bieber like she's a 13-year-old girl and not a 43-year-old married mother of three. Peter sees this on television and realizes just how far gone Lois really is. She's not just having a midlife crisis anymore. She's completely lost touch with reality. Brian tells Peter that he needs to go get Lois and bring her back before she does something she can't take back. Peter agrees and rushes to the Quahog Civic Center to find his wife. Meanwhile, Lois has managed to get backstage at the concert. How she accomplished this is actually pretty telling about her state of mind. She bribes a security guard with pinkberry frozen yogurt. That's it. That's all it takes for Lois to gain access to a famous teenage pop star's dressing room. She walks backstage like she belongs there, and she finds Justin Bieber in his private area. Now let's be absolutely clear about what Lois is trying to do here. Justin Bieber, at the time this episode takes place, is portrayed as being extremely young. He's a teenage heartthrob, probably around 17 or 18 years old. Lois is 43. She is more than twice his age, and she has intentionally snuck into his dressing room with the explicit goal of seducing him. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't her accidentally ending up in a compromising situation. She planned this. She wanted this. She is actively trying to have sex with someone young enough to be her child. When Peter bursts into the dressing room, he finds Lois in an embrace with Justin Bieber. They're not quite at the point of having sex yet, but they're clearly heading in that direction. Lois has her arms around this teenage boy, and Justin is going along with it because, presumably, he doesn't fully understand that this is a married, middle-aged woman having a psychological breakdown. Peter's reaction is immediate rage. He starts punching Justin Bieber repeatedly in the face, beating him up while yelling about Lois being his wife. Now, we need to acknowledge something important here. Peter is wrong to physically assault Justin Bieber. Violence is not the answer, even when you catch your wife trying to cheat on you with a teenager. But Peter's anger is completely justified. His wife just tried to commit what could legally be considered statutory rape, depending on the specific age of consent laws. Even if it's technically legal, it's absolutely morally wrong for a woman in her 40s to pursue sexual contact with a teenage boy. Justin Bieber, while getting punched, tells Peter to relax and calls him old man, which only makes Peter angrier. The whole scene is chaotic and violent and deeply uncomfortable. Security eventually separates them, and Peter demands that Lois come home with him right now. And Lois refuses. She actually refuses to go home with her husband after he caught her trying to cheat on him with a teenager. Her justification is that Peter called her old and ugly in that poem, so she's entitled to do whatever she wants now. This is where Lois's behavior crosses from understandable midlife crisis into genuine sociopathic territory. Yes, Peter hurt her feelings. Yes, his poem was cruel and insensitive. But Peter never tried to cheat on her. Peter never abandoned their children. Peter never pursued sexual contact with someone inappropriate. Lois is using Peter's one moment of insensitivity as justification for weeks of increasingly destructive behavior that culminated in attempted infidelity with a minor. Peter, to his credit, actually apologizes. Despite the fact that Lois just tried to sleep with Justin Bieber, Peter tells her that he's sorry for the poem and that he loves her exactly the way she is. He says he doesn't want young Lois or party girl Lois. He wants his Lois, the real person he married. This is actually a pretty mature and loving response considering the circumstances. Peter is trying to take responsibility for his part in hurting Lois, while also expressing that he values who she really is. And Lois? She eventually agrees to come home and be herself again. But there's no real acknowledgement of how far over the line she went. She doesn't apologize for abandoning the family. She doesn't apologize for trying to cheat. She doesn't acknowledge that pursuing a teenager was completely inappropriate and potentially criminal. The episode treats it like Lois was just acting out, and now everything can go back to normal. But the reality is that she did serious damage to her marriage and her family. The episode ends with a weird moment where Peter declares his love for Lois, but then immediately messes up her age, saying she's older than she actually is. Lois corrects him, and Peter, reverting to his usual self, tells her to get out of the house. It's played for laughs, but it also shows that the underlying issues in their marriage haven't actually been resolved. Peter still doesn't fully respect Lois, and Lois still feels entitled to extreme behavior when she's upset. What makes this episode particularly bad for Lois's character is that it establishes a pattern we see throughout the series. Whenever Lois feels insecure or unhappy, she doesn't communicate with Peter or work on fixing the actual problems in their marriage. Instead, she pursues attention from other men, often younger men, as a way to make herself feel desirable again. This isn't healthy behavior. This is a woman who bases her self-worth entirely on male attention and will pursue that attention regardless of appropriateness or consequences. The Justin Bieber incident also reveals something disturbing about Lois's sense of boundaries. She saw a teenage boy and thought it would be appropriate to pursue him sexually. She didn't consider how this would affect him, how it would affect her children if they found out, how it would affect her marriage. She just wanted to feel young and desirable again, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get that feeling, even if it meant crossing major ethical and possibly legal lines. Throughout this entire episode, Lois's friends never really call her out either. Bonnie and the other women in her social circle just sort of watch this crisis unfold without staging an intervention or telling Lois that she needs professional help. The show treats midlife crisis as this inevitable thing that happens to people, where they're just allowed to go crazy for a while until they decide to stop. But in reality, Lois's behavior during this period was genuinely harmful to everyone around her, and she should have faced actual consequences. The lasting impact of this episode is that it makes it harder to see Lois as a victim in her marriage. Yes, Peter is often insensitive and stupid. Yes, he doesn't always treat Lois with the respect she deserves. But Lois's response to feeling disrespected is to completely abandon her moral compass and pursue increasingly inappropriate behavior. She doesn't try to fix her marriage or improve communication with Peter. She just decides that if Peter hurt her feelings, she's entitled to hurt him back in whatever way will make her feel better in the moment. Lois Comes Out of Her Shell is ultimately a story about a woman who had legitimate reasons to be upset, but chose the worst possible ways to cope with those feelings. Instead of being a cautionary tale about how not to handle a midlife crisis, the show kind of just treats it as something funny that happened once. But for anyone actually watching and paying attention, it's clear that Lois revealed some genuinely disturbing aspects of her character. She's willing to cheat. She's willing to pursue minors, and she's willing to abandon her family entirely when she decides her own happiness is more important than her responsibilities. That's not a midlife crisis. That's a character showing you exactly who they are when they think they have an excuse to stop pretending to be a good person. Moving on to one of Lois's most selfish arcs in the entire series, we need to talk about the time she discovered shoplifting and became so addicted to stealing that she ended up in prison, then forced her entire family to become fugitives from the law. This episode shows that when Lois finds something that makes her feel good, she'll pursue it obsessively, regardless of the consequences for everyone around her. The episode is called Breaking Out is Hard to Do, and it aired during season 4. The title is a play on that old Neil Sedaka song about breaking up, but instead, it's about breaking out of prison, which should tell you immediately how bad this situation gets. The whole disaster starts during what should be a completely normal grocery shopping trip. Lois is at the checkout counter, and she realizes she doesn't have enough money to pay for everything in her cart. Now, this is a situation that happens to people sometimes. You miscalculate your budget. You grab more than you can afford. The prices were higher than you expected. Normal people handle this by putting some items back, or using a credit card, or asking the cashier to remove things until the total is manageable. But Lois doesn't do any of those reasonable things. Instead, she tells the cashier she's going to return a ham to the meat department, walks away with it, and then just stuffs it into her purse and walks out of the store. This is Lois's first theft, and the show makes it very clear that she experiences an intense rush from getting away with it. She describes it as thrilling, exciting, almost intoxicating. The adrenaline of doing something wrong and not getting caught gives her a high that she immediately wants to experience again. And this is where any responsible adult would recognize they just did something dangerous and make sure to never do it again. But Lois is not a responsible adult when it comes to her own desires. She's someone who will chase whatever makes her feel good, and right now, stealing makes her feel incredible. Lois goes on an absolute shoplifting spree. She starts small, stealing little items from various stores around Quahog. But like any addiction, she quickly needs bigger and bigger thrills to get the same rush. She escalates from small items to expensive objects, stuffing designer clothes into bags, walking out with electronics, taking jewelry. She's stealing compulsively now, not because she needs these things, or even particularly wants them, but because the act of theft itself has become her drug of choice. The montage of Lois's crime spree is played for comedy, with upbeat music and quick cuts of her stealing from different stores. But if you actually pay attention to what's happening, it's genuinely disturbing. This is a grown woman with 3 children at home, a husband who depends on her, a household that needs managing, and she's spending her days committing crimes for fun. She's not stealing food to feed her hungry family. She's not stealing medicine because someone's sick. She's stealing because it makes her feel alive, and she doesn't care about the risks. The stealing gets more and more outrageous. Lois steals a Matisse painting, an actual valuable work of art worth probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. She steals a car muffler, which requires her to literally crawl under a vehicle in a parking lot. She's taking insane risks now, doing things that could get her seriously hurt or caught, and she cannot stop herself. The addiction has completely taken over. Brian eventually notices what's going on. He sees Lois bringing home all these stolen items and confronts her about it. And to Lois's credit, when Brian points out how wrong this is, she actually seems to realize she's made a terrible mistake. She agrees to return everything she stole and face the consequences of her actions. This could have been a moment of growth for Lois, a chance for her to take responsibility and make things right. But she doesn't get that chance, because Joe Swanson shows up to arrest her before she can return any of the merchandise. Now, Joe is just doing his job here. He's a police officer, and Lois has committed multiple felonies. But the timing is unfortunate, because it means Lois doesn't get to voluntarily make amends. Instead, she's arrested and taken to court, where she stands before a judge to answer for her crimes. And this is where Lois does something so monumentally stupid that it defies all logic. Lois gives an apologetic speech to the judge. She explains that she was feeling empty inside, that she felt like she had a void in her life she was trying to fill. The judge actually seems moved by this explanation. He's clearly considering letting her off with a warning or maybe just probation, which would be an incredibly lenient sentence, considering the value of everything she stole. Lois is about to walk away with barely any consequences for a massive crime spree. And then she tries to steal the judge's gavel right there in the courtroom. Think about how insane this is. Lois is standing in front of a judge who's about to give her mercy, and her addiction is so powerful that she cannot help herself from trying to steal something right in that moment. The compulsion overrides all common sense, all self-preservation, all concern for her family. The judge, understandably furious at this disrespect, sentences her to 3 years in prison. Peter sneezes at the wrong moment, and the judge adds 2 more years, making it a total of 5 years behind bars. Lois is taken to prison, and the Griffin household immediately falls apart. Without Lois managing everything, the house descends into complete chaos. Peter can't take care of the kids properly. Meals don't get made, nothing gets cleaned, homework doesn't get done. The family realizes very quickly that they absolutely need Lois home, not because they care about her well-being or rehabilitation, but because their lives are too difficult without her doing all the work. So Peter comes up with a plan. Instead of waiting for Lois to serve her sentence like a responsible person would do, instead of maybe learning to manage the household himself during her absence, Peter decides they're going to break Lois out of prison. This is a felony. This is conspiracy to help a prisoner escape. This will make the entire family fugitives from the law. But Peter doesn't think about any of that, because his life is harder without Lois around. During a prison visit, Peter manages to smuggle Lois out by stuffing her entire body into his mouth. Don't ask how this works physically, because it doesn't make sense. But somehow Peter swallows Lois whole and walks out of the prison with her inside him. They make it to the parking lot, where Peter regurgitates Lois into a laundry van, and the entire family drives away as escaped fugitives. Now, they're all criminals. Chris, Meg, Stewie, Brian, Peter, and Lois are all guilty of prison escape and harboring a fugitive. The kids had no choice in this decision. Peter made this choice for them without considering how it would affect their futures. And it's entirely because Lois couldn't control her shoplifting addiction in the first place. One person's selfish behavior has now destroyed the entire family's legal standing in society. The Griffins end up in Asian Town, which is portrayed as Quahog's version of Chinatown, mixed with various Asian cultural stereotypes. They rent a terrible apartment in a rundown building and try to start new lives under assumed identities. Chris gets a job as a rickshaw driver, pulling people around in a cart like some kind of historical transportation. Stewie ends up working in a sweatshop sewing shoes until he accidentally sews a shoe to his own hand and gets fired. Peter tries to become a sumo wrestler, despite having no training and no understanding of the sport. Their life as fugitives is miserable. They're living in poverty in a cramped apartment, working terrible jobs, constantly looking over their shoulders for police. The kids can't go to school. They can't use their real names. They can't have any contact with their friends or the life they knew before. All of this because Lois wanted the thrill of shoplifting and couldn't stop herself even when given multiple chances. Joe, being a dedicated police officer, tracks them down. He sees Peter on television during a sumo wrestling match and realizes where the family is hiding. What follows is an extended chase sequence through Asian Town, with Joe pursuing them in a police helicopter while they run through the streets and eventually into the city sewers. The chase is played for comedy, with references to Star Wars and other action movies, but the underlying reality is that Joe is just trying to do his job while the Griffins are desperately trying to avoid the consequences of their crimes. In the sewers, they run into characters from the Goonies, because why not add more pop culture references? But the chase continues relentlessly, with Joe tracking them through the underground tunnels. Eventually, Joe slips and nearly falls off a ledge into what would presumably be his death. Lois has a choice here. She can let Joe fall and escape, or she can save him and surrender. To her credit, Lois saves Joe's life. She pulls him back from the ledge and prevents him from falling. This is arguably the most selfless thing Lois does in this entire episode. She finally puts someone else's well-being ahead of her own interests and accepts that she needs to face justice for her crimes. Joe, grateful that Lois saved his life, somehow manages to get her sentence remanded. We don't get details on how this works legally, but the implication is that Joe pulls strings to get Lois released and everything goes back to normal for the Griffins. But let's think about what actually happened here. Lois committed multiple felonies because she was bored and wanted excitement. She got caught and was appropriately sentenced to prison time. Instead of accepting responsibility and serving her sentence, she allowed her family to break her out and turn all of them into fugitives. They lived as criminals for weeks, with the children working in dangerous conditions, and the whole family constantly at risk of arrest. Joe nearly died chasing them, and in the end, Lois faces basically no real consequences because she did one good deed at the last possible moment. This episode establishes that Lois is willing to put her entire family at risk for her own selfish desires. She didn't think about how her shoplifting might affect Peter and the kids. She didn't consider that getting arrested would devastate their household. She didn't care that breaking out of prison would make them all fugitives. At every step of this disaster, Lois chose her own immediate gratification over the long-term well-being of her family. What's particularly galling is that Lois never really apologizes or shows genuine remorse for any of this. She saves Joe at the end, which is good, but she doesn't sit her family down and say she's sorry for putting them through weeks of living as fugitives in poverty. She doesn't acknowledge that her addiction destroyed their normal lives. She doesn't commit to therapy or treatment to address the underlying issues that made her start stealing in the first place. Everyone just goes home and pretends none of it happened. The show also completely glosses over the legal implications of everything that occurred. In reality, breaking someone out of prison is a serious federal crime. Everyone who participated would face charges. The family would have criminal records. Peter would definitely go to jail. But because this is Family Guy, where consequences rarely stick between episodes, the Griffins just resume their normal lives like nothing happened. This sends a terrible message that criminal behavior doesn't really matter if you can find a way to wriggle out of punishment. Lois's kleptomania arc reveals something fundamental about her character. She's not just someone who makes mistakes or acts impulsively. She's someone who will pursue destructive behavior even when she knows it's wrong, even when it hurts the people she supposedly loves, and even when there are clear and obvious consequences. The shoplifting wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a sustained pattern of criminal behavior that she chose to continue over and over again until she literally couldn't stop herself even in front of a judge. This episode also shows that Lois expects other people to clean up her messes. She created this entire disaster, but it's Peter and the kids who suffer the most consequences. They're the ones living in terrible conditions in Asiantown. They're the ones who had to abandon their lives. And Lois just goes along with it, accepting their sacrifice as her due without really acknowledging what she's put them through. That's not the behavior of a good wife or mother. That's the behavior of someone who fundamentally doesn't consider how her actions affect others. Now we need to talk about the time Lois ran for mayor of Quahog and prove that when given actual power and authority, she immediately becomes one of the most corrupt politicians in the town's history. This episode shows that Lois doesn't just make bad decisions in her personal life. When she has the opportunity to make decisions that affect an entire community, she's even worse. The episode is called It Takes a Village Idiot, and I Married One, which is already a pretty savage title that basically calls Peter an idiot right in the episode name. It aired during season 5, and the story was actually written by Alex Borstein, the voice actress who plays Lois. Borstein based this episode on a one-woman show she had, worked on about why women would never become president, and she called it her homage to Hillary Clinton. That context is important because it means the person who voices Lois specifically wrote an episode showing Lois becoming completely corrupt the moment she gains political power. The whole situation starts when the Griffin family decides to take a vacation at Quagmire's cabin near Lake Quahog. They're having a nice time, and everyone decides to go swimming in the lake. But the moment they get in the water, something is clearly wrong. Their hair starts falling out. All of them, including the kids, lose every strand of hair on their heads because the water is contaminated with something toxic. They scramble out of the lake and discover that the Quahog oil refinery has been dumping toxic waste directly into the water. This is a legitimate environmental crisis. The lake is being poisoned by industrial waste, which is causing actual physical harm to anyone who comes into contact with it. Lois does what any responsible citizen would do and goes to complain to Mayor Adam West, expecting him to take action against the company. But Mayor West just casually admits that he sanctioned the dumping. He allowed Quahog oil to poison the public lake in exchange for free hair oil. That's it. That's all it took to bribe the mayor into allowing environmental destruction. Of free hair products, Lois is rightfully outraged by this blatant corruption. She tells Mayor West that she's going to run against him in the next election and that she's going to win. This is actually a noble goal. Lois has identified genuine corruption in local government and decided to do something about it. She wants to clean up the lake, restore the environment, and end the corrupt relationship between the mayor's office and Quahog Oil. If the episode had ended with Lois successfully accomplishing these goals and maintaining her integrity, it would have been a great story about standing up to corruption. But that's not what happens. Not even close. Lois launches her campaign with genuinely good intentions. She has detailed plans to improve the city, actual policy proposals that would benefit the citizens of Quahog. During campaign debates, she tries to explain these plans in depth, giving voters real information about what she would do as mayor. The problem is that voters are bored by detailed policy discussions. They don't want to hear about infrastructure improvements or environmental regulations. They want simple sound bites and emotional appeals. Meanwhile, Mayor Adam West is proving to be far more politically savvy than anyone expected. When asked questions during debates, he responds with completely unrelated statements and glittering generalities that mean absolutely nothing. He doesn't answer questions. He doesn't provide policy details. He just says vague things that sound good. And the voters eat it up. They love Mayor West's non-answers because they're entertaining and easy to understand. Brian watches Lois's campaign faltering and gives her some advice. He tells her that undecided voters are the biggest idiots in the country, and if she wants to win, she needs to dumb down her message. This is where Lois makes her first major compromise. Instead of educating voters and trying to raise the level of political discourse, she decides to manipulate them with fear tactics and meaningless buzzwords. Lois starts dropping terms like Jesus and terrorists into her speeches with no context or meaning. She just says these controversial words because they generate emotional reactions from voters. When asked about her policy positions, she simply responds with 9/11 over and over again. She's not saying anything substantive. She's not explaining how she would actually improve Quahog. She's just exploiting people's fears and emotions to win votes. And it works. The voters respond enthusiastically to Lois's dumbed-down campaign. They don't care that she's not actually saying anything meaningful. They like hearing buzzwords that make them feel certain emotions. Lois wins the election in a landslide, becoming the new mayor of Quahog. She successfully defeated the corrupt Mayor West and now has the opportunity to actually make positive changes in her community. At first, Lois does follow through on her main campaign promise. She uses fear tactics to raise funds for cleaning up Lake Quahog. She manipulates voters with the same empty rhetoric she used during the campaign, but this time it's directed toward raising money. The funding campaign is successful, and Lois manages to completely clean up the lake. The toxic waste is removed, the water is purified, and the environment is restored. This is a genuine accomplishment. Lois has actually made Quahog better, but here's where things start to go wrong. After cleaning up the lake, Lois has leftover cash from the fundraising campaign. This is taxpayer money that was raised for a specific purpose. The ethical thing to do would be to return it to the citizens, put it in a general fund for future projects, or find another environmental cause to support. But Lois sees that money and decides she wants something for herself. She embezzles $600 to purchase a designer purse. This is Lois's first act of corruption as mayor. She's stealing public money to buy luxury items for herself. And Brian, who's supposed to be the voice of reason, actually sees this happen and expresses disappointment. He knows what Lois is doing is wrong. He knows she's betraying the principles she campaigned on. But he doesn't really do anything to stop her or report the embezzlement. He just looks disappointed and lets it slide. That $600 purse is just the beginning. Once Lois has gotten away with embezzling money once, the corruption becomes easier. She sees a fur coat in a store window that costs $4,300. This is an absurdly expensive item, way beyond what a mayor's salary would reasonably support, especially for the mayor of a small town like Quahog. But Lois wants it. She's developed a taste for luxury items purchased with other people's money, and now she wants this coat. That's when Bob Grossbeard shows up. He's the president of Quahog Oil, the same company that was dumping toxic waste into the lake in the first place. The entire reason Lois ran for mayor was to stop this company from polluting the environment. Bob Grossbeard represents everything Lois campaigned against, and he makes Lois an offer. He'll buy her that $4,000 fur coat if she allows Quahog Oil to resume dumping toxic waste into Lake Quahog. Think about what this means. Lois is being asked to completely abandon the primary reason she ran for mayor. The lake cleanup was her signature achievement. It was the thing she promised voters she would do. People voted for her specifically because they wanted the lake cleaned up and protected. And now she's being offered a bribe to undo all of that work and allow the pollution to continue. Any person with actual integrity would refuse this offer immediately. Any politician who genuinely cared about their community would report this attempted bribery to authorities. But Lois doesn't do either of those things. She accepts the bribe. She takes the fur coat and signs off on allowing Quahog Oil to resume dumping toxic waste into the lake she just spent public money cleaning up. This is absolutely insane behavior. Lois has betrayed every principle she claimed to stand for. She ran on an anti-corruption platform and then became immediately corrupt. She promised to protect the environment and then sold out the environment for a coat. She raised public funds for lake cleanup and then allowed the lake to be poisoned again. Every voter who supported her has been betrayed. Every taxpayer whose money went to the cleanup has been scammed. And Lois did it all for a piece of clothing. The consequences are immediate and severe. Toxic waste starts flowing into Lake Quahog again. The water becomes polluted worse than before. Citizens who swim in the lake develop deformities and health problems. The wildlife that had started returning to the cleaned lake dies off again. Even Jake Tucker, a character with an upside-down face, becomes normal, which the show treats as evidence of how messed up the pollution has become. Everything Lois accomplished is undone, and it's entirely her fault. Meanwhile, Peter is enjoying being the First Lady of Quahog. He's taking advantage of Lois's position to do whatever he wants. He reroutes the town's entire electrical system, causing rolling blackouts across Quahog, just so he can use the power to reanimate dead comedian Jim Varney. When Peter realizes he actually wanted to reanimate John Belushi instead, he tries to shoot Jim Varney to kill him again, but Varney somehow gets the gun, and Peter runs away, screaming. This whole subplot shows how Lois's position is being abused by her family for their own entertainment, while citizens are literally suffering from power outages. Eventually, Lois has a moment of realization. She sees the lake poisoned again. She sees the deformities in people and animals, and she understands that power has completely corrupted her. She's become exactly what she ran against. She's become worse than Mayor Adam West, who at least was openly corrupt from the beginning. Lois pretended to be better, got elected on promises of reform, and then betrayed everyone who believed in her. So Lois resigns She steps down as mayor and tells Adam West he can have his job back. This is framed as some kind of redemption, like Lois is doing the right thing by admitting she was corrupted and stepping aside. But let's think about what actually happened. Lois ran for office, manipulated voters with fear tactics and empty rhetoric, embezzled public funds, accepted bribes, allowed environmental destruction, and then just quit when the consequences became too obvious. She faces no legal consequences for embezzlement. She faces no charges for accepting bribes. She doesn't even lose the fur coat that she got through corruption. The episode ends with everything going back to normal. Mayor West is back in office. The lake is still polluted, and Lois just goes home to resume being a housewife like none of this ever happened. The citizens of Quahog, who voted for change and got betrayed, don't get any kind of justice or restitution. The taxpayer money that Lois embezzled is never returned. Quahog Oil faces no consequences for bribing a public official. Everyone just accepts that this is how things are and moves on. What makes this episode particularly damning for Lois is that it wasn't a slow corruption over time. She went from righteous crusader against corruption to accepting bribes in what appears to be just a few weeks or months. The moment she had access to public funds and the power to make decisions, she started stealing and making corrupt deals. This suggests that Lois was always capable of this behavior and just needed the opportunity to show it. The episode also reveals that Lois is incredibly susceptible to manipulation when it comes to luxury items. She embezzled money for a purse. She accepted a bribe for a coat. These aren't life-changing amounts of money or essential items. They're status symbols, things that make Lois feel important and wealthy. She was willing to betray her entire town so she could wear expensive clothes. That's not a person who should have power over others. Brian's role in this episode is particularly disappointing. He advised Lois to dumb down her campaign, which started her down the path of manipulation. He witnessed her embezzling money and just expressed disappointment instead of reporting it. He watched her accept bribes and didn't try to stop her or expose the corruption. Brian is supposed to be the intellectual voice of reason, but he enabled Lois's corruption every step of the way. It Takes a Village Idiot proves that Lois cannot be trusted with power or responsibility beyond her own household. When given the opportunity to serve her community and make positive changes, she instead stole from taxpayers and sold out the environment for personal gain. She ran on promises of reform and immediately became more corrupt than the person she replaced. This episode shows that Lois's moral compass is completely broken when it comes to temptation, and that she'll betray anyone, including an entire town full of voters who believed in her, if it means she gets something she wants. Let's talk about the time Lois completely lost her mind during Christmas and literally tried to destroy the holiday for her entire family. This episode reveals that when Lois doesn't get the appreciation she thinks she deserves, she's willing to sabotage one of the most important days of the year for her children. It's vindictive, it's cruel, and it shows just how selfish Lois can be when she feels slighted. The episode is called A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas, and it's actually the show's very first Christmas special, airing back in Season 3. The title is already mocking traditional Christmas specials with that word freakin' thrown in there, letting you know this isn't going to be a heartwarming holiday tale. And boy, does it deliver on that promise. The setup starts innocently enough. It's Christmas time in Quahog, and Lois is doing what she does every year, managing absolutely everything to make sure the holiday goes perfectly. She's decorating the house, shopping for presents, planning the dinner, organizing the family activities, coordinating with neighbors. She's basically a one-woman Christmas production company. Meanwhile, Peter wants to do nothing except sit on the couch and watch his favorite Christmas television specials, including something called Kiss Saves Santa, which is exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Lois keeps reminding Peter that he needs to donate one present to charity. Just one gift. That's all she's asking him to do, while she handles literally everything else. She's not asking him to organize the charity drive or shop for the specific gift. She just needs him to take one present and drop it off at the Toys for Toddlers charity. This is such a simple task that most people could accomplish it without even thinking about it. But Peter is Peter, so of course he messes it up. Peter doesn't just donate one present. He donates all of them. Every single gift the family bought for each other, gone. Given away to the charity. When he comes home and Lois asks him to bring the presents in from the trunk, Peter casually mentions he already dropped them all off at Toys for Toddlers the night before. There's this amazing moment where Brian asks if Peter donated all the gifts, and Peter genuinely doesn't understand the difference between presents for the family and presents from the family. He's that dumb. Now, losing all your Christmas presents the day before Christmas is legitimately upsetting. The kids won't have anything to open. All that shopping Lois did was wasted. The money they spent is gone. This is a real problem. But here's what's interesting. Lois doesn't freak out. She stays remarkably calm. She just tells everyone they need to go to the mall and buy new presents. It's inconvenient and annoying, but she's handling it with grace. At this point, Lois is being the adult in the situation, keeping everything together despite Peter's massive screw-up. While the family goes to the mall for emergency Christmas shopping, Brian stays home to watch the turkey cooking in the oven. This should be simple. Just make sure the bird doesn't burn. But an ember from the fireplace shoots out onto the rug and starts a fire. Brian tries to put it out, but Peter has replaced the fire extinguisher with a novelty item filled with plastic snakes. When Brian opens it, plastic snakes shoot into the fire and explode, making everything worse. The house catches fire, the turkey gets completely burned, and the interior of the home is destroyed. When the family comes back from shopping, they find their house is a charred wreck. The living room is black with soot, furniture is destroyed, the turkey is a smoking pile of ash. This is catastrophic. Not only do they not have presents now, they don't even have a house to celebrate Christmas in. They don't have dinner. Everything is ruined. And still, somehow, Lois maintains her composure. She looks at the devastation and says they just need to clean up a bit. She's trying so hard to save Christmas, to keep everyone's spirits up, to make sure the holiday happens despite multiple disasters. But then Meg makes a fatal mistake. She tells Lois they're out of paper towels. That's it. That's what breaks Lois. Not Peter giving away all the presents. Not the house burning down. Not the ruined turkey. The paper towels. This tiny, insignificant detail is what sends Lois over the edge into complete madness. Lois's breakdown is legendary. She screams at the top of her lungs about how everyone thinks Christmas just happens, how they think goodwill falls from the sky. But it doesn't. According to Lois, Christmas falls out of her backside through pure effort and exhaustion. She lists everything she does to make the holiday perfect while everyone else does nothing. And then she tells her family they can cook their own turkey, wrap their own presents, decorate their own tree, and ride a one-horse open sleigh to hell. She grabs a chair, screams, and throws it through a window before jumping out and running into the night. Now, let's pause here and acknowledge that Lois has legitimate grievances. She does work incredibly hard to make Christmas happen. She does get very little help from her family. Her frustration is understandable. If she had just walked away and said she's done, she's not doing Christmas anymore, everyone is on their own, that would be justified. Taking a break from holiday stress is reasonable. Going on strike from unappreciated labor makes sense. But that's not what Lois does. She doesn't just quit. She actively tries to destroy Christmas for everyone else. She goes on a rampage through Quahog, attacking the very concept of holiday cheer. She berates happy people who are enjoying the season, mocking them for their optimistic attitudes. She pushes George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life off a bridge. She melts Frosty the Snowman with a flamethrower. These are fictional characters, sure, but the symbolism is clear. Lois is trying to murder Christmas itself. Then she goes to the town square where there's a huge Christmas tree with an ornamental star on top. This tree represents the community's collective Christmas spirit, the shared joy of the season. And Lois decides to climb it so she can destroy that star. She's literally trying to tear down the symbol of Christmas for the entire town. Not just her family, but everyone in Quahog. She's so angry about not being appreciated that she wants to ruin the holiday for thousands of people who have nothing to do with her situation. Think about how selfish this is. Yes, Peter messed up with the presents. Yes, Brian let the house burn down. Yes, her family takes her for granted. But the random citizens of Quahog didn't do anything to Lois. The families enjoying Christmas in the town square aren't responsible for her stress. The children looking at the Christmas tree don't deserve to have their holiday destroyed because Lois is having a bad day. But Lois doesn't care. Her pain justifies attacking innocent people's happiness. The family eventually tracks Lois down to the town square and finds her climbing the giant Christmas tree. Stewie, trying to earn points with Santa Claus, gives a speech about Jesus and the meaning of Christmas. It's actually a pretty thoughtful monologue for Stewie, talking about how the holiday is supposed to be about goodwill and togetherness. Lois watches from the tree and has a change of heart. She realizes she's gone too far and starts climbing back down. But then Peter, because he's an idiot, tells the police to shoot Lois with a tranquilizer dart. They fire a powerful sedative at her while she's climbing down the tree. This could have killed her. She could have fallen from a great height while unconscious. But somehow she survives, and the episode ends with Lois heavily drugged, sitting in a rocking chair drooling while the family wishes everyone a Merry Christmas. She's so sedated, she can barely speak. This is framed as a happy ending, but really, it's just Lois being chemically pacified, so she can't protest anymore. What makes this episode particularly bad for Lois's character is that her response to stress is to try to destroy happiness for everyone around her. She doesn't communicate her needs clearly. She doesn't set boundaries. She doesn't ask for help in a way people can actually respond to. Instead, she bottles everything up until she explodes in rage and tries to literally demolish the holiday for her entire community. And here's the thing. The paper towels that set her off? Meg found them seconds after Lois ran away. They were right there. The problem Lois thought was insurmountable was actually already solved. She went on her destructive rampage over something that wasn't even a real issue. This shows that Lois wasn't really mad about the paper towels. She was mad about everything, and she was just looking for an excuse to explode. The episode also reveals that Lois's idea of making Christmas perfect is exhausting herself to the point of breakdown rather than delegating tasks or accepting that holidays don't need to be perfect. She creates her own misery by refusing to ask for help until it's too late, and then she punishes everyone else for not reading her mind. This is a pattern we see throughout the series. Lois takes on too much, refuses assistance, gets overwhelmed, and then lashes out at people who had no idea she was struggling. What's particularly disturbing is that Lois's rampage included attacking representations of childhood joy and innocence. Melting Frosty the Snowman is attacking a beloved children's character. Trying to destroy the town Christmas tree is attacking something children look forward to seeing every year. Lois's anger at her family shouldn't extend to trying to ruin the holiday for other people's children, but she doesn't care. In her mind, if she can't have a perfect Christmas, nobody should have any Christmas at all. The ending of the episode tries to sell the idea that everything worked out. The family got their presents, including Stewie mysteriously receiving plutonium from Santa. Peter got his Kiss Saves Santa special, and Lois is sitting there drooled on the couch, still heavily sedated. The show treats this as resolution, but it's actually pretty dark. Lois had a legitimate mental breakdown, tried to destroy public property, and the solution was to drug her into submission. Nobody actually addressed the underlying problems. Nobody learned to help Lois with holiday preparations. They just knocked her out so she'd stop complaining. A very special Family Guy. Freaking Christmas establishes that Lois's response to feeling unappreciated is vindictive destruction. She doesn't want to fix the problems in her family dynamic. She wants to punish everyone for not valuing her enough. And when her own family isn't enough of a target for her rage, she'll happily expand to attacking the entire community. That's not the behavior of a good wife or mother. That's the behavior of someone who thinks the world owes them something and will throw a massive tantrum when they don't get it. Now, we need to talk about one of the most disturbing examples of Lois exploiting Peter for her own ego. This episode shows that when Lois wants to win at something, she's willing to destroy Peter's health and potentially cause permanent brain damage. Also, she can beat a rival piano teacher in a competition that ultimately means nothing. The episode is called Wasted Talent, and it aired during season 2. The title itself is telling because it's got a double meaning. On one level, it refers to Peter's wasted talent for playing piano, a skill nobody knew he had. But on another level, it's about how Lois is literally wasting Peter as a person, using him up like he's disposable, all for the sake of winning a trophy. The setup involves 2 separate storylines that eventually connect. First, there's a contest at the Pawtucket Brewery, where they've hidden 5 silver scrolls in random beer bottles, and whoever finds them gets a tour of the facility. It's basically a parody of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, but with beer instead of chocolate. Peter becomes obsessed with finding a scroll and starts drinking enormous amounts of Pawtucket Patriot Ale to increase his chances. Meanwhile, Lois has her own competition brewing. She's a piano teacher, and she has this bitter rivalry with another teacher named Alexis Radcliffe. Every year there's a piano competition, and every year Alexis's students win, while Lois's students come in second place. Alexis rubs this in Lois's face constantly, making snide comments about how there are more important things in life than piano competitions, especially for those who have no chance of winning. This drives Lois absolutely crazy with jealousy and resentment. Lois is desperately searching for a piano student good enough to beat Alexis's star pupil. She's going through student after student, but none of them have the talent she needs. Her best student, a girl named Ling, drops out of the competition entirely, possibly because Lois was working her too hard. This leaves Lois high and dry with no one to enter in the competition. Her obsession with beating Alexis is consuming her, but she has no way to achieve her goal. That's when Peter comes home, completely wasted after drinking all day trying to find a silver scroll. He's stumbling around, barely able to stand, and Lois is about to yell at him for being drunk again. But then Peter sits down at the piano and starts playing. And he's not just playing, he's playing like a virtuoso. His fingers fly across the keys with perfect technique, playing complex classical pieces with the skill of a concert pianist. It's genuinely beautiful music, the kind that would take years of training to achieve. Lois is stunned. She had no idea Peter could play piano at all, let alone at this level. She starts testing him, asking him to play different pieces, and he performs them all flawlessly. As long as he's drunk, Peter is an absolute genius at the piano. The moment he sobers up, the talent disappears completely. He becomes a musical savant, specifically when he's heavily intoxicated. Now, here's where any normal, caring spouse would be concerned. They would see this as a weird quirk, maybe something to investigate medically, but definitely not something to exploit. The fact that Peter can only access this skill while poisoning his body with alcohol should be a red flag. But Lois doesn't see a problem. She sees an opportunity. Lois immediately decides to enter Peter in the piano competition as her student. She tells him that he's going to be her first champion, completely ignoring the fact that achieving this goal requires keeping her husband in a constant state of drunkenness. She literally says they need to get a case of beer because they have a lot of practicing to do. She's planning to spend days or weeks keeping Peter perpetually drunk so he can maintain his piano playing ability. Think about what this means for Peter's health. Alcohol is a poison that damages every organ in the body when consumed in excess. The liver, the pancreas, the heart, the brain, all of these suffer when someone drinks heavily. And Lois is planning to force Peter into sustained heavy drinking for days on end. The medical consequences could be severe. Alcohol poisoning, liver damage, permanent brain injury. These are all real possibilities when someone drinks as much as Lois is planning to make Peter drink. But Lois doesn't care about any of that. She's so obsessed with beating Alexis that Peter's well-being becomes irrelevant. She starts the training immediately, bringing Peter beer after beer to keep him drunk enough to practice. Every time Peter starts to sober up and lose his playing ability, Lois panics and forces more alcohol into him. She's literally using beer as a drug to control her husband's behavior and abilities. The training montage shows Peter getting progressively more intoxicated while Lois coaches his playing. He's slurring his words, stumbling around, barely able to focus on anything except the piano. At one point, Peter calls the alcohol his talent juice and begs Lois for more when he feels himself sobering up. She's conditioned him to associate the piano with drinking, creating a dangerous psychological connection between performance and intoxication. What makes this even worse is that Lois fully understands the risks. She knows she might be damaging Peter's brain. There's a moment where she explicitly worries about whether his brain will survive long enough to enjoy victory. She's aware that what she's doing could cause permanent harm, and she does it anyway, because winning the competition is more important to her than Peter's health. The day of the competition arrives, and Peter is so drunk he can't even find the piano. Lois has to physically turn him around and move him a few inches to put him in front of the instrument. He's completely disoriented, unable to process basic spatial information, showing clear signs of severe intoxication. Any responsible person would recognize that Peter needs medical attention, not a piano performance. But Lois just positions him in front of the keys and waits for him to play. And of course, Peter performs brilliantly. Despite being barely conscious, his drunk brain produces beautiful music that wins the competition. Lois gets her trophy, finally beating Alexis and proving that her student is superior. She's achieved her goal. She's gotten the validation she wanted, and all it cost was her husband's health and dignity. After they win, Lois has a brief moment of reflection where she worries that she may have harmed Peter's health for her own selfish need to win. This acknowledgement shows that she knew all along what she was doing was wrong. She understood the risks, saw the damage, and chose to prioritize winning over Peter's well-being. And the show kind of just moves on from this without any real consequences or resolution. Lois got what she wanted, so everything's fine, right? Wrong. What Lois did in this episode is genuinely abusive. She exploited a discovered talent that only manifests under dangerous conditions and deliberately maintained those conditions for her own benefit. She kept her husband in a state of severe intoxication for days, knowing it could cause permanent damage, because she cared more about beating a rival than about Peter's health. That's not being a supportive spouse. That's treating your partner like a tool to be used and discarded when convenient. The episode also reveals that Lois's competition with Alexis is purely about ego. There's no prize money mentioned, no career advancement, nothing tangible at stake. Lois just wants the satisfaction of winning, of proving she's better than someone she's jealous of. And she's willing to sacrifice her husband's health for that satisfaction. That's incredibly selfish. What's particularly disturbing is that Peter goes along with this plan willingly because he's drunk and not thinking clearly. Lois is essentially taking advantage of Peter's impaired judgment to get him to do something that harms him. If Peter were sober and able to properly consent, He might refuse to participate in a scheme that requires him to stay drunk for days. But Lois never gives him that choice. She just starts the process and keeps him too intoxicated to object. The ending of the episode shows Peter suffering from a terrible hangover, but still being forced to perform again when Lois needs him. She's created a system where Peter's value to her is directly tied to his willingness to poison himself. That's not a healthy dynamic in any relationship. That's exploitation disguised as partnership. Wasted talent establishes that Lois will sacrifice Peter's long-term health for short-term victories. She doesn't see him as a person with needs and vulnerabilities. She sees him as a resource to be exploited when useful. The fact that she briefly worries about the consequences doesn't absolve her, because she knew the risks before she started and chose to proceed anyway. Lois made a conscious decision to harm her husband for personal gain, and the show treats this as just another wacky Family Guy plot instead of the genuinely disturbing abuse that it actually represents. Now let's talk about the time Lois literally imprisoned 4 men in a sweltering attic with no ventilation and left them to suffer. This episode shows that when Lois gets annoyed with Peter, she's willing to endanger not just him, but his innocent friends who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The episode is called A Lot Going On Upstairs, and it aired during season 14. The title has a double meaning, referring both to the guys hanging out in the attic and to the idea that there's a lot happening in someone's mind, which connects to the main plot about Stewie's nightmares. But the attic subplot is what we're focused on here, because it shows Lois at her most vindictive and dangerous. The situation starts when Stewie begins having nightmares and refuses to sleep in his own bed. He starts sleeping in Peter and Lois's bedroom instead, which means Peter can't sleep properly. Looking for alternative sleeping arrangements, Peter discovers there's a futon in the attic. He decides to move up there temporarily, but then realizes the attic is actually pretty comfortable. It's away from the noise of the house. It's got space, and it's basically unused. So Peter decides to turn it into his man cave, his personal peat pad where he can relax and get away from household stress. Now, Peter spending time in the attic is actually pretty reasonable. He's not abandoning his family. He's not neglecting his responsibilities. He's just found a quiet space in his own home where he can decompress. Lots of people have personal spaces like this, whether it's a garage, a basement, or a spare room. It's healthy for individuals in a family to have somewhere they can go to be alone sometimes. But Lois doesn't see it that way. She sees Peter enjoying himself somewhere she can't easily supervise him, and that bothers her. Peter invites his friends over to hang out in the attic. Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland come up to spend time with Peter in his new space. They're having fun, playing games, enjoying each other's company. At one point, they're playing with insulation, treating it like snow, and having insulation fights. They put Joe in Stewie's old Jolly Jumper baby toy, which Joe thinks is a paratrooper harness. They're being loud and silly, but they're not hurting anyone or destroying anything important. They're just guys hanging out and having a good time. Then they start playing lawn darts in the attic. Now, this is admittedly not the smartest activity to do indoors, but it's also not causing any real problems. Lois comes up to check on what the noise is about, and she sees the guys playing lawn darts. Peter quickly lies and says they're not, but then immediately celebrates winning at lawn darts, completely giving away that they were indeed playing. It's typical Peter stupidity, harmless but annoying. Lois tells Peter and his friends that this is their home, not some frat house, and she wants them out of the attic immediately. Peter refuses. He says they're not leaving because they're having too much fun up there. Quagmire mentions that he just showed them his impression of someone, and Peter found it surprisingly good. They're being defiant, sure, but they're grown men in Peter's house, and they have every right to spend time in the attic if they want. This is where Lois makes a decision that crosses from annoying wife into genuinely dangerous territory. She says if they like the attic so much, they can enjoy the attic. And then there's the sound of electric whirring. Lois has sealed the attic door shut. She's trapped 4 men inside a room with no way out, no ventilation, and no way to get food or water. She's essentially created a prison in her own home. The guys immediately realize what's happened. They're locked in. Peter tries to find a way out, but every potential exit is blocked. The attic has no windows they can escape through, no alternate doors, nothing. They're completely trapped, and Lois just walks away, leaving them there indefinitely. She doesn't say how long they'll be locked in. She doesn't establish any conditions for their release. She just traps them and disappears. What makes this particularly disturbing is that Lois has trapped 3 innocent people along with Peter. Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland didn't do anything wrong. They were invited guests in Peter's house, hanging out in a space Peter had created. They weren't being destructive or dangerous. They were just there. But Lois punishes them anyway, imprisoning them along with Peter because she's mad at her husband. That's holding innocent people hostage out of spite. The conditions in the attic quickly become unbearable. The guys start overheating because there's no ventilation. They're sweating, becoming dehydrated, losing their grip on reality. The show depicts them suffering from genuine heat exhaustion, which is a serious medical condition that can lead to heat stroke and death. Lois is literally endangering their lives out of annoyance that they were playing games too loudly. The guys try to call for help through the vents, shouting for anyone to hear them. But Meg is downstairs listening to a podcast about what to do when a bear attacks, and she's wearing headphones, so she can't hear anything. Nobody in the house realizes that 4 men are trapped in the attic suffering from dangerous heat exposure. Lois knows they're up there, and she's chosen to ignore their suffering. Peter eventually tries to negotiate with Lois by yelling through the door. He threatens that if she doesn't let them out immediately, he's going to defecate on her wedding dress. This is a disgusting threat, but it also shows how desperate the situation has become. Peter is willing to destroy a precious family heirloom just to get Lois to acknowledge that what she's doing is wrong. Lois responds that Peter wouldn't dare, showing she's more concerned about her possessions than about the men suffering in her attic. Peter insists he'll do it, and he'll make all his friends do it too. He tells Quagmire to pull down his pants, though Quagmire initially refuses because he doesn't want to be part of this disgusting plan. Cleveland says if it'll get them out of there, he'll do it, admitting he's been holding it in for 6 hours. This is a medical emergency at this point. Cleveland has been trapped for so long that he's suffering from severe physical discomfort. The threats escalate with Peter announcing that Cleveland's pants are off and his are coming down next. Quagmire is yelling that they're not bluffing and begging Lois to open the door. Joe is crying that he misses his wife Bonnie. These are grown men reduced to begging and threatening to vandalize a wedding dress just to escape from a dangerous situation. And it's all because Lois was annoyed that they were playing games. Finally, Lois caves in. She grabs a towel rack from the bathroom and uses it to pry open the door she had sealed shut. The men come tumbling out, falling onto the floor. But it's too late. Cleveland announces they were too late and they've already defecated on the gown. Joe says they've ripped a big hole in the ceiling. Quagmire admits he vomited on Peter's backside and isn't sure if it got on the dress or not. The wedding dress is ruined, the ceiling is destroyed, and the men are physically and psychologically traumatized from their imprisonment. In Lois's response to all of this, she suggests they both went a bit too far, trying to make it seem like she and Peter are equally responsible for what happened. But that's not true at all. Peter was playing games with his friends. Annoying? Maybe. Dangerous? No. Lois imprisoned 4 men in dangerous conditions and left them there until they were suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Those are not equivalent actions. One is mildly irritating. The other is genuinely life-threatening. The show treats this as a comedic situation where both sides went too far and everything's fine now. But if you actually think about what happened, it's horrifying. Lois trapped people against their will, endangered their health, ignored their cries for help, and only released them when they threatened to destroy her property. She valued a wedding dress more than human safety. She was willing to let men suffer rather than admit she overreacted. What's particularly galling is that Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland had no power in this situation. They couldn't leave because they were physically trapped. They couldn't call the police because Lois was using her authority as the homeowner to imprison them. They were completely at her mercy, and she showed them none. She let them cook in that attic, suffering from dangerous heat levels, purely because she was mad at her husband. This episode establishes that Lois's anger can override her basic human decency. When she's frustrated with Peter, she's willing to endanger innocent bystanders and cause physical harm to multiple people. She doesn't think about consequences or consider that her actions might be criminal. She just does whatever will make Peter suffer, regardless of who else gets hurt in the process. The fact that the episode ends with Lois suggesting they both went too far shows she learned absolutely nothing from this incident. She doesn't apologize properly. She doesn't acknowledge that imprisoning people is wrong. She just wants to move on and pretend it never happened. But Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland were traumatized by this experience. Quagmire even says he might need 2 weeks off from the friendship, suggesting that Peter's association with Lois has made spending time with him dangerous. A lot going on. Upstairs proves that Lois is willing to use violence and imprisonment to control Peter's behavior. She doesn't communicate or negotiate. She doesn't set reasonable boundaries or ask for compromise. She just locks people in rooms and lets them suffer until they submit to her will. That's not being a wife or a mother. That's being a warden who sees her family and their friends as prisoners to be controlled and punished at her discretion. Let's talk about one of the most uncomfortable moments in the entire series, when Lois literally tries to seduce her own daughter's boyfriend. This happens in the Season 8 episode, Go Stewie, Go, which aired on March 14th, 2010. And yes, this is exactly as creepy as it sounds. We're talking about a middle-aged mother making moves on a teenager who's dating her daughter. But here's what makes it even worse. Lois doesn't just have a fleeting moment of attraction that she fights against. She actively pursues this kid, creates opportunities to be alone with him, and eventually makes out with him on the family couch. This isn't a mistake or an accident. It's a calculated betrayal of both her husband and her daughter. The episode starts with something genuinely shocking for anyone who's watched Family Guy. Meg brings home a boyfriend who is, by all accounts, completely normal. His name is Anthony, and he's voiced by Lucas Grabeel. Now, this is huge because Meg's dating history is usually a parade of disasters. We're talking about guys with no legs, guys who are actually buildings, guys who are prison inmates. The show has consistently portrayed Meg as so desperate and pathetic that she'll date literally anything. So when she brings home an actual normal, attractive teenage boy, the entire town of Quahog loses its collective mind. Peter and Lois are skeptical at first, which makes sense given Meg's track record, but when they meet Anthony, they're stunned. He's polite, he's good-looking, he's age-appropriate, he has all his limbs. The shock is so profound that Peter literally calls the entire town to come witness this miracle. People start gathering outside the Griffin house just to watch Meg and Anthony make out through the window. The crowd is so large that Cleveland Brown, who moved away to his own spin-off show, actually comes back to Quahog specifically to witness this impossible event. Dr. Hartman even examines Anthony to confirm he's perfectly normal, like he's some kind of medical anomaly. This setup is important because it establishes just how rare and precious this relationship is for Meg. For once in her life, she has something good. She has a boyfriend who treats her well, who isn't using her, who genuinely seems to like her. It's probably the first time in the entire series that Meg has experienced anything resembling normal teenage romance. And Lois is about to destroy it for the most selfish reasons imaginable. The problems start when Anthony compliments Lois on her appearance. He tells her she looks good, which is just basic politeness when you're meeting your girlfriend's parents. But Peter, being Peter, immediately undercuts the compliment by making jokes about Lois's age. He starts pointing out that she's getting older, making cracks about her advancing years, basically doing everything possible to make her feel insecure about aging. Now, Peter being insensitive is nothing new. The guy has the emotional intelligence of a potato. But what happens next reveals something disturbing about Lois's character. Instead of dealing with her insecurity in a healthy way, instead of talking to Peter about how his comments hurt her feelings, Lois decides the appropriate response is to pursue her teenage daughter's boyfriend. That night, after Peter and Lois go to bed, Lois happens to see Meg and Anthony making out on the couch. A normal mother would either give them privacy or tell them to knock it off because they're in a common area. But Lois watches them, and instead of maternal concern or appropriate boundaries, she becomes sexually aroused. The show actually depicts her fantasizing about being in Meg's place, imagining herself as the one kissing Anthony. This is where the episode crosses from uncomfortable into genuinely disturbing territory. Lois isn't just noticing that Anthony is attractive in an abstract way. She's actively fantasizing about her daughter's boyfriend while watching them kiss. The next step in Lois's spiral is even worse. She confides in Bonnie Swanson about her feelings, presumably looking for someone to talk her out of this insane idea. But instead of telling Lois to get therapy or remember that she's a married woman lusting after a teenager, Bonnie reveals that she too had an affair. This conversation apparently gives Lois permission in her own mind to pursue this further. It's worth noting here that the show frames this as somehow Peter's fault for making Lois feel old. But feeling insecure about your age doesn't justify pursuing your child's boyfriend. Millions of women deal with aging anxiety without attempting to seduce teenagers. Lois then creates an opportunity to be alone with Anthony by manipulating Meg. She sends Meg on an errand to pick up her grandfather, which is purely a pretext to get Meg out of the house. This is premeditated. Lois doesn't stumble into a compromising situation. She deliberately engineers a scenario where she'll be alone with Anthony. When Meg leaves, Lois makes her move. She starts flirting with Anthony, getting physically close to him, making it clear what she wants. And here's the thing that makes Anthony's role in this complicated. He's willing. The episode shows him responding to Lois's advances, but we need to talk about what this actually means. Anthony is a teenager, probably around Meg's age, which would make him somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. Lois is explicitly stated to be in her 40s in other episodes. When an adult pursues a teenager, even if that teenager seems willing, it's not really consent in the meaningful sense. There's a massive power imbalance. Lois is an authority figure as his girlfriend's mother. She's an adult with fully developed judgment and impulse control. Anthony is a kid whose brain literally hasn't finished developing yet. But the show doesn't really grapple with these implications. Instead, it plays the situation for comedy. Lois and Anthony start making out on the couch, the same couch where he was just kissing Meg. And of course, because this is a sitcom, Meg comes back at the worst possible moment. She forgot the car keys, returns to the house, and walks in to find her mother and her boyfriend in a passionate embrace. The show even uses the bass jingle from Seinfeld at this moment, that iconic sound effect they used whenever someone got caught doing something embarrassing, trying to frame this as just another wacky sitcom misunderstanding. But this isn't a wacky misunderstanding. This is a mother betraying her daughter in one of the worst ways possible. Meg has been emotionally and verbally abused by her family throughout the entire series. She's constantly told she's ugly, worthless, and unwanted. And now, the one good thing she has, the one relationship that makes her feel valued and normal, has been violated by her own mother. The look on Meg's face when she sees them is absolutely devastating. This is a girl who already has rock-bottom self-esteem, discovering that even her own mother sees her as competition. Lois tries to apologize, but her apology reveals exactly how twisted her thinking is. She says, I never meant to steal him from you. Notice the phrasing there. She never meant to steal him. That implies she was trying to do something else, something that somehow makes this better. But Meg immediately calls out how insulting this statement is. She says, "Is that what you think? You stole him from me? Are you kidding? You couldn't steal him from me." This leads to one of the most brutal confrontations in the series. Lois, instead of being appropriately ashamed, gets defensive. She says, "Well, I do know a few things, Meg, and clearly, if I wanted him, I could have him." Let that sink in. Lois has just been caught making out with her daughter's boyfriend, and her response is to assert her sexual superiority over Meg. She's not apologizing for the betrayal. She's bragging about how she could totally steal Anthony if she wanted to. Like, this is some kind of competition she's winning. Meg fires back with both barrels. She tells Lois, "You really think you stand a chance? Look at you. You're old. You're nothing." And then she drops the bomb that makes this whole situation even more uncomfortable. "You couldn't even imagine the things I do for him." The implication is crystal clear. Meg is revealing that she's been performing sexual acts with Anthony, probably acts that she's not entirely comfortable with, to keep him interested. And she's throwing this in Lois's face to prove that Lois can't compete with her level of desperation. This moment reveals the truly sad reality of Meg's situation. She's not defending her relationship because it's healthy or because Anthony truly cares about her. She's defending it because she's so starved for affection and validation that she'll do anything to keep this boyfriend, even things that make her uncomfortable. And she's learned this behavior from growing up in a family that constantly tells her she's worthless. Lois's betrayal isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening to a girl who's already been damaged by years of emotional abuse, much of it from Lois herself. The episode tries to wrap everything up with Peter apologizing to Lois for making her feel old, and Lois apologizing to Meg for her behavior. But this resolution is deeply unsatisfying, because it frames the entire incident as somehow being Peter's fault. Yes, Peter was insensitive about Lois's age, but millions of people experience insensitive comments from their spouses without attempting to seduce their children's partners. The show is essentially saying that if your husband hurts your feelings, you get a free pass to betray your daughter and pursue a teenager. There's also no real discussion of what happened to Anthony. Does he break up with Meg after this? Does he stay with her despite making out with her mom? The episode doesn't tell us because Anthony isn't really a character in this story. He's just a prop used to illustrate Lois's midlife crisis and Meg's perpetual victimhood. But in reality, this kid just had an extremely inappropriate sexual encounter with an adult woman who happens to be his girlfriend's mother. That's the kind of thing that creates serious psychological issues. What makes this episode particularly gross is how it fits into the larger pattern of how Family Guy treats Meg. The show has consistently portrayed Meg as the family punching bag, someone who exists to be humiliated and degraded. And this episode takes that dynamic to its logical extreme. It's not enough that Meg is verbally abused by her family. It's not enough that she's portrayed as ugly and undesirable. Now, her own mother has to prove that even when Meg has something good, Lois can take it away from her. The message is clear. Meg doesn't deserve happiness, and even her own mother sees her as inferior. The episode also reveals something important about Lois's character that contradicts her earlier portrayal. In the early seasons, Lois was positioned as the voice of reason in the Griffin household. She was the responsible parent who tried to keep Peter's chaos under control and provide some stability for the kids. But as the series progressed, the writers started giving Lois increasingly terrible behavior, trying to make her as flawed and morally compromised as Peter. This episode is a perfect example of that shift. The old Lois would have been horrified at the thought of pursuing her daughter's boyfriend. This Lois actively schemes to make it happen. There's also the uncomfortable fact that this entire plotline exists because the writers thought it would be funny. Family Guy has always pushed boundaries and gone for shock value, but this crosses a line from edgy comedy into something that's just unpleasant. The betrayal of a child by their parent isn't funny. The sexualization of a teenage boy by an adult woman isn't funny. The destruction of a girl's first healthy relationship isn't funny. The episode tries to play it all for laughs, but the emotional reality of what's happening is too dark to be dismissed as just a joke. When you really think about what Lois does in this episode, it's staggering. She sees her daughter happy for possibly the first time ever. She sees Meg in a relationship with someone who treats her well and makes her feel valued. And Lois's response is to destroy that relationship to make herself feel better about getting older. That's not the behavior of a mother who loves her child. That's the behavior of someone so self-absorbed that she can't stand to see her daughter have something good, especially if it highlights her own insecurities. The episode ends without any real consequences for Lois. Meg is upset, but she'll be back to her usual punching bag role by the next episode. Anthony disappears from the series, never to be mentioned again. Lois faces no lasting judgment from Peter, her other children, or the community. The show treats this as just another wacky Griffin family adventure, something to laugh about and then forget. But for anyone paying attention, this episode reveals Lois as someone capable of truly cruel behavior toward her own child, someone willing to sacrifice her daughter's happiness for a momentary ego boost. And that's not funny. That's just sad. Now we need to talk about the episode that started Lois's pattern of infidelity throughout the series. This is Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey, which aired on March 11th, 2007 during Season 5. And yes, we're talking about the episode where Lois has sex with former President Bill Clinton. What makes this episode particularly significant is that it represents the first time in the series that Lois cheats on Peter, establishing a pattern that would repeat itself in later seasons. But what's really messed up about this situation is how it happens, and what Lois's justification is for betraying her husband. The episode starts innocuously enough. Peter visits an aquarium and gets attacked by an octopus, which makes him realize he's completely out of shape. So he decides to start working out at the gym, trying to get physically fit. This is already unusual because Peter rarely commits to self-improvement. But his fitness journey gets interrupted in the most unexpected way when Bill Clinton's limousine breaks down right in front of the Griffin house. Being Peter, he decides to be helpful by trying to lift the rear end of the limo without a jack, so Clinton's Secret Service can change the tire. This is peak Peter logic, thinking he can just manually lift a several-ton vehicle. Obviously, this goes horribly wrong. Peter throws out his back, gets a severe hernia, and ends up hospitalized. While he's recovering in the hospital, feeling depressed about getting old and realizing his physical limitations, Bill Clinton visits him. Clinton gives Peter a pep talk about how age is just a state of mind and promises to show him how to still have fun despite getting older. This sounds supportive and friendly on the surface, but it's actually the beginning of an extremely toxic friendship that will nearly destroy Peter's marriage. When Peter recovers, Clinton takes him out on the town and they become best friends. They start spending enormous amounts of time together, going to Chuck E. Cheese's to play Dance Dance Revolution, hitting up clubs, and generally behaving like college kids on spring break. The problem is that their idea of fun quickly escalates into illegal and dangerous behavior. They start smoking marijuana together and causing all kinds of mischief while high. At one point, they literally steal a pig from a farmer's barn because they think it would be hilarious. Peter wakes up the next morning face down in his kitchen with no memory of what happened the night before, surrounded by destruction and chaos. This is where Lois decides to intervene. She's watched Peter's friendship with Clinton spiral out of control, and she's genuinely concerned that Clinton is a terrible influence on her husband. Peter is engaging in criminal behavior, coming home wrecked, and acting increasingly irresponsible. As the responsible parent in the household, Lois feels she needs to protect her family from this destructive friendship. So she makes what seems like a reasonable decision. She'll go talk to Bill Clinton directly and ask him to stop hanging out with Peter. Let's pause here and acknowledge what Lois is trying to do. She's attempting to have a mature, adult conversation with someone who's having a negative impact on her spouse. She's not being controlling or unreasonable. Peter literally stole livestock while high with the former president. Her concerns are completely valid. A normal person in Clinton's position would understand and respect a wife's request to back off from a friendship that's causing problems in a marriage. But Bill Clinton, as portrayed in this episode, is not a normal person. He's depicted as an incredibly charismatic, manipulative person who can talk anyone into anything. Lois goes to Clinton's hotel room to confront him about his behavior and his influence on Peter. She's there as a concerned wife and mother, trying to protect her family. But what happens next is where the episode crosses from comedy into something deeply uncomfortable. Instead of having the conversation Lois came there to have, Bill Clinton seduces her. The show doesn't depict him forcing himself on her or physically threatening her. Instead, it portrays him as so charming and persuasive that Lois simply can't resist him. Within minutes of arriving at his hotel room, Lois ends up in bed with him, having sex with the man she came there to complain about. The episode then shows Lois waking up next to Clinton, immediately overcome with guilt and horror about what she's done. She says things like, "What was I thinking?" and "I don't know what came over me," showing genuine remorse. She's clearly devastated by her own actions and panicking about how to save her marriage. The show wants us to understand that Lois didn't plan this, that she was somehow overwhelmed by Clinton's persuasiveness. The episode even includes Clinton asking for the cigar afterward, a direct reference to the Monica Lewinsky scandal, making it clear this is his pattern of behavior. But here's the problem with how the show frames this situation. It treats Lois's infidelity as something that happened to her rather than something she chose to do. The episode suggests that Bill Clinton is just so incredibly charismatic and persuasive that no one can resist him, not even happily married women who came specifically to tell him to leave their husbands alone. This framing removes agency from Lois and places all the blame on Clinton's seductive powers, as if Lois was helpless in the situation. The reality is that Lois made a choice. She chose to go to Clinton's hotel room alone instead of having this conversation in a public place or with Peter present. She chose to stay in that room when Clinton started being inappropriate instead of leaving immediately. And she chose to have sex with him despite being married to Peter and having 3 children at home. Clinton's charisma doesn't excuse any of this. Plenty of people encounter charming, attractive people without immediately betraying their spouses. The discovery scene is absolutely brutal. Peter shows up at Clinton's hotel room, expecting to hang out with his friend. He walks in, takes a few seconds to process what he's seeing, and then screams, "Hey Bill, I took this money from Lois's purse. I don't think she'll notice because she's here, humping you." The delayed reaction makes the scene darkly comedic, but what Peter is experiencing is genuine betrayal. His wife just slept with his best friend. That's a double betrayal that would destroy most people. Peter is devastated. He leaves Lois and goes to stay at Quagmire's house, unable to even look at his wife. Quagmire, of all people, tries to comfort him, which tells you how serious the situation is. When Quagmire is being the voice of emotional support, you know things have gone completely off the rails. Peter tells Quagmire he can't believe Lois would cheat on him, showing genuine hurt and confusion about why his wife would do this. Lois, consumed with guilt, decides that the only way to save her marriage is to give Peter permission to cheat. She tells him he can sleep with one woman of his choosing to make them even. This is her attempt at fairness, creating a balance where they're both guilty of infidelity, so neither has moral high ground. It's a deeply flawed approach to marriage counseling, but in Lois's panicked state, it seems like the only solution. She's so desperate to save her marriage that she's willing to experience the same pain she just inflicted on Peter. Peter's choice for his revenge affair is shocking. He chooses Lois's mother, Babs Pewterschmidt. This is deliberately chosen to be as hurtful to Lois as possible, just as Lois sleeping with Peter's best friend was maximally hurtful to him. It's escalation designed to make Lois feel the same betrayal and disgust that Peter experienced. And shockingly, Babs is completely willing. She shows up ready and eager to sleep with her son-in-law, which reveals some deeply disturbing things about her character and her relationship with her daughter. But here's where the episode takes an unexpected turn that actually redeems Peter's character. As Peter is about to go through with sleeping with Babs, he realizes he can't do it. Despite everything Lois has done, despite his anger and hurt, he loves her too much to betray her this way. He tells Babs he can't go through with it and goes running back to Lois, naked, declaring his love for her. It's a genuinely sweet moment that shows Peter's capacity for forgiveness and his deep love for his wife, even when she's hurt him terribly. Peter running through Carter Pewterschmidt's mansion completely naked leads to one of the episode's funniest exchanges. Carter sees naked Peter and screams, "Why the hell are you naked in my mansion?" Peter responds, why aren't you?" After a pause, Carter says, "You're all right, Griffin." It's a rare moment of Carter actually respecting Peter, acknowledging that Peter's love for Lois and his unwillingness to betray her, even when given permission, shows real character. Lois is relieved and grateful that Peter has forgiven her. They reconcile, with Peter choosing their marriage over revenge. The episode seems to be heading toward a happy ending, where they've both learned something valuable about their relationship and the importance of forgiveness. Lois genuinely regretted her actions, showed immediate remorse, tried to make things right, and Peter demonstrated that his love for her is stronger than his desire for revenge. It's actually a relatively healthy resolution to infidelity by Family Guy standards. But then, the episode throws in one final twist that undercuts everything. Peter, feeling that his marriage is restored, decides he should also forgive Bill Clinton. He goes to Clinton's apartment to patch things up and let him know there are no hard feelings. And just like what happened to Lois, Peter ends up in bed with Clinton too. The episode ends with the revelation that Clinton seduced both Peter and Lois, proving that he's depicted as a depraved bisexual who will sleep with anyone regardless of their gender or marital status. This ending is played for laughs, suggesting that Clinton is so irresistibly charismatic that he can seduce literally anyone, regardless of their sexual orientation or relationship status. Peter technically evens the score with Lois by also sleeping with Clinton, which the show presents as darkly comedic justice. They both betrayed each other with the same person, so in the show's twisted logic, they're now even and can move forward with their marriage. But this ending also reveals something important about how the episode views responsibility. By having both Peter and Lois fall victim to Clinton's seductive powers, the show is essentially saying that Clinton is the real villain here, and both Griffins are victims of his manipulative charm. It removes moral responsibility from both of them and places all the blame on Clinton's character. The episode was even criticized by the Parents Television Council, who called it the worst TV show of the week, though their criticism was probably more about the sexual content than the ethical implications. What's significant about this episode in the larger context of the series is that it establishes Lois as someone capable of infidelity. Before this episode, despite all her flaws, Lois had been faithful to Peter. She was the responsible one, the moral center of the family, the person who tried to keep everyone on the right path. But this episode breaks that pattern and shows that Lois is just as capable of selfish, destructive behavior as Peter. The difference, and this is important, is in how Lois and Peter handle their guilt. Lois immediately feels terrible about what she did, panics about how to fix it, and tries to make things right by giving Peter permission to even the score. Peter, on the other hand, actually can't go through with his revenge affair because he loves Lois too much. The episode ultimately portrays both of them as fundamentally good people who made mistakes under the influence of an incredibly manipulative person. However, as TV Tropes points out, This episode represents a franchise original sin for the series. While Lois's infidelity in this episode is somewhat justified by Clinton's extreme persuasiveness, and Lois shows genuine remorse, later episodes would have Lois cheating with far less justification and showing far less regret. The pattern starts here. Lois cheats on Peter, and the show treats it as comedy rather than serious betrayal. Future episodes would have her making out with Meg's boyfriend Anthony, kissing the host of Family Feud, and engaging in other inappropriate behavior, all without the remorse or consequences shown in this episode. What makes this episode particularly uncomfortable in retrospect is how it normalizes Lois's infidelity. By framing her first affair as something that just happened because Clinton was too charming to resist, the show establishes that Lois isn't really responsible for her actions when faced with temptation. This becomes a pattern. Lois does something terrible, blames external circumstances or other people's behavior, shows brief remorse, and then faces no lasting consequences. Her marriage to Peter survives despite repeated betrayals because the show needs to maintain its status quo. The episode also reveals the double standard in how Peter and Lois's bad behavior is treated. When Peter does something stupid or destructive, it's portrayed as Peter being Peter, and Lois has to clean up his mess. But when Lois does something terrible, it's framed as a reaction to someone else's bad behavior. In this case, it's Peter's friendship with Clinton that drives Lois to confront Clinton, which leads to the affair. Later episodes would have Lois blame Peter's insensitive comments about her age for her making out with Anthony. The show consistently gives Lois excuses for her bad behavior, while Peter is simply expected to be terrible. There's also something worth noting about the subplot of this episode, which involves Lois and Stewie trying to potty train Brian. It's played entirely for comedy, with Brian being terrified of the toilet and treating it like some kind of arcane fixture. This subplot has nothing to do with the main story, but it's thematically relevant in an odd way. Just as Brian is learning to control his bodily functions and behave in a civilized manner, Lois is losing control of her impulses and behaving in uncivilized ways. The contrast is striking. The dog is trying to learn human standards of behavior, while the human is abandoning those standards entirely. In the end, Bill and Peter's bogus journey is significant because it fundamentally changes Lois's character. Before this episode, she was flawed but fundamentally faithful. After this episode, infidelity becomes part of her pattern of behavior. The show would continue to have her cross boundaries, betray trust, and then blame circumstances or other people for her choices. This episode is where that pattern starts, establishing that Lois is capable of terrible things when the right temptation comes along, and that the show will always find a way to minimize her responsibility for those terrible things. Perfect. I found the episode. It's A House Full of Peters. Season 15, Episode 20. Let me write Section 10 about Lois's affair with Peter's donor son, Larry. Section 10. Lois cheats with Peter's donor son. We've saved one of the most disturbing episodes for last, and this one might actually be the worst thing Lois has ever done in terms of pure betrayal and moral bankruptcy. This is A House Full of Peters, which aired on May 21st, 2017, as the season finale of Season 15. In this episode, Lois not only cheats on Peter again, but she does it with someone who is technically Peter's biological son. Yes, you read that correctly. Lois has an affair with Peter's sperm donor offspring, creating a situation that's not quite incest, but is definitely in the same disturbing neighborhood. And what makes this even worse is how the whole situation develops, and what it reveals about Lois's character and her marriage to Peter. The episode starts innocently enough with the wives having a ladies' night out. During this girls' night, they all make prank phone calls to their husbands because apparently grown women with children still think prank calls are peak entertainment. Lois decides to prank Peter by pretending to be a long-lost daughter, probably expecting him to play along with the joke or get mildly confused. But Peter's reaction is completely unexpected. He panics, stammers, and immediately hangs up the phone. His response is so extreme and suspicious that Lois immediately knows something is wrong. A normal prank call would get a normal reaction, maybe confusion or laughter. But Peter's panic suggests he's hiding something serious. The next day, Lois's curiosity gets the better of her, and she follows Peter to find out what he's hiding. She trails him to a sperm bank, which is already raising some serious questions. Why is Peter going to a sperm bank? Is he donating now? Is he checking on past donations? Lois confronts the staff and discovers the shocking truth. Before their wedding, Peter sold sperm to raise money for dial-up modem impression lessons. Yes, that's the reason. Not to pay bills or save for the wedding or anything remotely responsible. Peter sold his genetic material so he could learn to make funny computer noises. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Peter had donated sperm and signed agreements that his identity would remain anonymous from any potential offspring. When Lois pranked him by pretending to be his daughter, Peter panicked because he thought his secret was out and that one of his biological children had somehow tracked him down. He rushed to the sperm bank to make sure his identity was still protected, terrified that his past was catching up with him. This is actually a somewhat understandable fear. Lots of sperm donors worry about unknown children showing up later in life. But Lois, being Lois, doesn't see it this way. Instead of understanding Peter's concerns about privacy and the complications of having unknown biological children, she convinces him that they should allow contact with any potential offspring. She frames this as the right thing to do, giving these children the chance to meet their biological father. On the surface, this sounds compassionate and fair. These are people who exist because of Peter's donation, and they might want to know where they came from. But Lois doesn't think through the practical implications of what she's suggesting. Shortly after Peter agrees to allow contact, they are greeted by what can only be described as an invasion. A massive crowd of Peter's biological children shows up at their house, people of all ages, sizes, and ethnicities. We're talking dozens of offspring, maybe more, filling up their entire yard. Peter apparently donated a lot of sperm, and that sperm was very successful at creating babies. The sheer number of people is overwhelming, and suddenly the Griffin household is dealing with a logistical nightmare that Lois created by insisting Peter open this door. Peter and Lois decide to host a backyard dinner party to get acquainted with all these new relatives. It's chaos, as you'd expect when dealing with dozens of strangers who all share Peter's DNA. Most of Peter's biological children are pleasant enough, but they're essentially strangers crashing into the Griffin family's life. After the dinner, everyone except the immediate family starts leaving to clean up and head home. And this is where Lois's terrible decision-making begins. One of Peter's offspring, a young adult named Larry, is the only one who offers to help Lois clean up after the party. Everyone else just leaves, but Larry stays behind to help with the dishes and putting away chairs. On the surface, this seems like simple politeness, but Lois reads way more into this gesture than she should. She starts projecting onto Larry, seeing him as a reminder of Peter back when they first got married. She tells herself that Larry reminds her of young Peter, back when Peter was supposedly more thoughtful and helpful. Let's pause here and examine what's actually happening. Lois is a middle-aged, married woman who's developing feelings for a young man who is her husband's biological son. This isn't her stepson from a previous marriage. This is someone who exists because of Peter's genetic material. The relationship is biologically similar to if Larry were Peter's son from another relationship, which would make Lois's attraction completely inappropriate. But because Larry was conceived through sperm donation rather than a sexual relationship, Lois seems to think this makes her attraction somehow more acceptable. Lois starts spending time with Larry, going out for afternoon dates that she probably justifies to herself as just being friendly with Peter's newfound offspring. But these aren't group outings with all of Peter's biological children. These are one-on-one dates with the specific young man she's attracted to. And during one of these outings, they kiss. Lois initiates or reciprocates a kiss with Peter's biological son, crossing a line that should never have even been approached. After the kiss, Lois is consumed with guilt. She realizes she's crossed a boundary and tries to backpedal, telling Larry they need to keep their relationship platonic. She knows what she did was wrong. She understands that kissing Peter's son, even if he's from a sperm donation, is a betrayal of her marriage. She tells Larry they can be friends, but nothing more, trying to put the genie back in the bottle. But the damage is already done, and Larry has misread the entire situation. Larry has fallen in love with Lois, or at least he thinks he has. Remember, this is a young man who just met his biological father for the first time and is probably experiencing all kinds of complicated emotions about identity and belonging. And now the wife of his biological father has kissed him and is giving him attention. Larry doesn't have the maturity or perspective to understand that what's happening is deeply inappropriate. He thinks this is a genuine romantic connection. The situation escalates when Larry comes to the house and offers to give Lois a back rub. But this isn't really a back rub. Larry tries to undo Lois's bra with his teeth, which is absolutely not a legitimate massage technique. This is a sexual advance, pure and simple. And Peter walks in at exactly the wrong moment, finding Larry with Lois in this compromising position. Peter sees his wife with his biological son in a situation that's clearly sexual, and everything explodes. Larry, instead of being embarrassed or apologetic, confesses everything. He tells Peter he's in love with Lois and reveals that they shared a kiss. He frames this as if he and Lois have some kind of real relationship, as if what happened between them was meaningful and mutual. Peter is devastated and furious. His wife kissed his son. His biological son is in love with his wife. And all of this happened because Lois convinced him to meet these offspring in the first place. Peter and Larry start fighting, an actual physical brawl in front of everyone. All the other biological children gather around to watch, witnessing this family drama unfold. Larry is younger and stronger, and he starts getting the upper hand in the fight. Peter is getting beaten by his own biological son while fighting over his wife. It's humiliating and painful and completely preventable if Lois had just maintained appropriate boundaries. Then, in a moment that's supposed to redeem her character, Lois hits Larry over the head with a flower pot, knocking him unconscious. Peter is confused, asking why Lois would stop Larry when Peter thought she and Larry were in a relationship. Lois declares that Larry was not her boyfriend and that she wasn't about to stand by and watch him hurt Peter. She tells Peter that they have something together that only age in a relationship can bring, implying that their years together means something that a brief fling with a younger man can't replace. This ending is supposed to be heartwarming. We're supposed to see Lois choosing Peter over the younger man, recognizing the value of their long marriage. Peter even notes that none of the other offspring stepped forward to help him, making Lois's intervention seem heroic. But this resolution completely glosses over the fact that Lois created this entire situation through her own terrible choices. Let's be clear about what actually happened here. Lois didn't just make one mistake. She made a series of deliberate choices that led to this disaster. First, she convinced Peter to meet his biological children despite his legitimate concerns. Then she developed an inappropriate attraction to one of those children. Then she went on private outings with him. Then she kissed him. Then she allowed the situation to continue, even after the kiss, seeing him again instead of immediately cutting off all one-on-one contact. And finally, she allowed him into their home, where he felt comfortable enough to make a sexual advance. The show wants us to believe that Lois hitting Larry with the flower pot is proof that she loves Peter and chooses their marriage. But the reality is that Lois only intervened after her affair created a physical fight that Larry was winning. If Larry hadn't been about to seriously hurt Peter, would Lois have stopped him? The episode doesn't answer that question because it's too busy trying to paint Lois as the hero of the situation. What makes this episode particularly disturbing is the nature of Larry's relationship to Peter. This isn't some random guy Lois met at work. This isn't even a friend's husband or Peter's actual friend. This is Peter's biological offspring, someone who shares 50% of Peter's DNA. In any normal ethical framework, this person would be considered off limits for romantic or sexual relationships with Peter's wife. The fact that Larry was conceived through sperm donation rather than a traditional relationship doesn't change the fundamental biology or the betrayal involved. The episode also raises uncomfortable questions about Lois's attraction patterns. She claims that Larry reminds her of Peter when they first got married, suggesting she's attracted to him because he has qualities that Peter used to have. But Larry is Peter's biological son. Any similarities between them are literally genetic. Lois is essentially saying she's attracted to a younger version of Peter's genes, which is deeply weird when you think about it. There's also the issue of Larry's age and maturity. The episode doesn't specify exactly how old Larry is, but he's clearly a young adult, probably in his early 20s at most. Lois is in her 40s and has 3 children. The power imbalance here is significant. Larry just found out who his biological father is and is probably dealing with serious identity issues and emotional vulnerability. Lois, as an adult with far more life experience and as his biological father's wife, has a responsibility to maintain appropriate boundaries. Instead, she takes advantage of his emotional state to pursue her own attraction. Peter's reaction to all of this is surprisingly measured, all things considered. Yes, he fights with Larry, but he forgives Lois relatively quickly. He accepts her explanation that she chose him over Larry, and that their marriage is stronger than a brief attraction. But this easy forgiveness is part of a larger pattern in the show, where Lois faces no real consequences for her repeated infidelities and boundary violations. Peter always forgives her. The family always stays together. And by the next episode, everything is back to normal. What the episode never addresses is the impact on Larry himself. This young man just found his biological father, developed feelings for his father's wife, was encouraged by those feelings being reciprocated, and then got physically assaulted and rejected. That's an incredibly traumatic series of events that will probably require years of therapy to process. But the show doesn't care about Larry's well-being. He's just a plot device, used to create conflict in Peter and Lois's marriage. The episode also never deals with how this affects the relationship between Peter and all his other biological children. After this disaster, do they still want to maintain contact with Peter? Do they blame him for Lois's behavior? Do they think the whole Griffin family is dysfunction Al and decide to stay away? The show doesn't tell us, because once the dramatic moment is over, all these people disappear from the series and are never mentioned again. What makes A House Full of Peters stand out in Lois's catalog of terrible behavior is how it combines multiple forms of betrayal. She betrays Peter through infidelity, again. She betrays Peter by pursuing his biological child. She betrays the trust of all Peter's offspring by sexualizing one of them. She betrays Larry by encouraging his feelings and then rejecting him violently. And she betrays her own family by bringing all this chaos into their home. It's a comprehensive disaster that touches every possible relationship in the episode. The episode ends with Peter and Lois apparently reconciled, but there's no real discussion of how they'll prevent this from happening again. There's no conversation about Lois's pattern of infidelity or why she keeps betraying Peter. There's no acknowledgement that this is part of a larger problem in their marriage. The show just moves on, resetting everything for the next episode. In the context of this video about every time Lois was a terrible wife, A House Full of Peters represents perhaps her most morally indefensible action. Hypnotizing Peter led to trauma. Abandoning the family during her midlife crisis was selfish. Becoming a kleptomaniac endangered everyone. The Bill Clinton affair was a moment of weakness. But pursuing Peter's biological son represents a special kind of betrayal that combines infidelity with a violation of fundamental family boundaries. It's the kind of thing that, in real life, would probably end a marriage permanently. But in Family Guy, it's just another episode. Just another example of Lois being a terrible wife who somehow never faces lasting consequences for her actions.